In 1990, a woman named Linda Enix stood alone in a carved stone chamber 30 meters below the streets of Malta. She had not planned to be there long. She had come to look at walls. She was an architectural researcher with a background in ancient building traditions, and the Hall Saflieni Hypogeum, a 5,000-year-old underground complex discovered in 1902, was the kind of site she visited professionally. She had a notebook, she had a flashlight, she had a scheduled afternoon above ground with other things on the agenda. Then she stepped into the room on the second level and spoke. She would describe what happened next in a paper published years later in a tone so carefully controlled it reads almost like a deliberate effort not to say what she actually experienced. The words she chose were, "An unexpected and significant acoustic response unlike anything I had previously encountered in a built structure." She canceled her afternoon plans. She stood in that room for 3 hours, and when she finally came up out of the ground, she had decided to spend the next 20 years trying to understand what she had just experienced. What she found, and what the instruments would later confirm, was that the room was not producing an echo. It was doing something else entirely, something the people who carved it out of solid rock 5,000 years ago had apparently built it to do on purpose. And that is what this investigation is about. Malta is a small island in the center of the Mediterranean, 30 kilometers south of Sicily. Most people know it, if they know it at all, as a warm place with old churches and good weather. Archaeologists know it differently. Malta is one of the most extraordinarily dense concentrations of prehistoric architecture on Earth. 7 megalithic temple complexes survive on the island and its smaller neighbor, Gozo, all dating to roughly the same period, between 3600 and 2500 BCE. Built from coralline limestone blocks weighing up to 20 tons, fitted without mortar, aligned with astronomical precision to specific solar events. Older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids of Giza, older than most things that have a name in the historical record. The culture that built them does not have an agreed-upon name. We know almost nothing about who they were, where they came from, or what they believed. We know only what they left. And then, around 2500 BCE, without apparent warning or known cause, they stopped. The temple sites were abandoned. 500 years later, a completely different population arrived on the island. No continuity, no record of transition. The builders simply ceased to exist as a people, leaving behind architecture so precisely constructed that engineers studying it today still disagree on how it was made. In 1902, construction workers in Valletta were digging the foundation of a new school when one of them fell through the ground. He landed in a chamber, 3 meters below street level, carved from solid rock, dark for the first time in roughly 5,000 years. They brought a lamp down, level below level, 30 meters descending into the earth. Walls smoothed with a precision no practical necessity could explain, ceilings curved with intention, and arranged throughout the chambers in positions the excavators would spend years attempting to interpret, were the bones of 7,000 people. The site was named the Hall Saflieni Hypogeum, and for most of the century following its discovery, it was studied primarily as a burial site, a place to put the dead. What it actually was built to do would not begin to become clear until Linda Enix stood in the wrong room on an otherwise ordinary afternoon and couldn't bring herself to leave. Enix did not publish immediately. This is worth noting. She was not someone with an agenda to push. She had no prior interest in acoustic archaeology as a discipline, because acoustic archaeology barely existed. No explanation has ever been offered. Before we continue, the evidence is real. The interpretation is yours. What do you think happened? Leave your theory in the comments. And if you're interested in mysteries that history never fully explained, subscribe and join us for the next investigation. As a discipline at the time, what she had was an observation she couldn't explain and a professional background that told her unexplained observations were worth pursuing. She went back to Malta several times. She brought recording equipment on one of those visits, basic by the standards of what would come later, but sufficient to capture something she could put on paper. What she recorded in the chamber on the second level, the room the excavators had called the Oracle Room, for reasons they couldn't quite articulate, was a standing resonance, a frequency the room produced when a human voice of the right pitch was introduced into the carved alcove on the north wall. The frequency was 110 hertz. She noted it. She did not know at that point what 110 hertz meant in neurological terms. That research didn't exist yet. She filed the measurement and kept working. And what she built over the following years was a picture of the Oracle Room so detailed and so strange that by the time she finally published the work formally in 2014, it had already circulated through the acoustic archaeology community for years, passed between researchers the way significant findings that don't fit existing categories tend to travel, quietly, hand to hand, with a certain reluctance to commit to what the data seemed to be saying. The Oracle Room sits on the second of 3 underground levels of the Hypogeum. It is not the largest chamber, it is not the deepest. It is modest in dimension, roughly 4 meters across, with a ceiling that curves overhead in a way that is slightly too precise to be coincidental. On the north wall, at approximately chest height, there is a carved alcove, a small niche cut into the limestone, a place where a person can step close and direct their voice into the rock. The original excavation report from 1902 noted that this room produced unusual effects. A male voice spoken into the alcove would resonate through the chamber in a way no other voice would. A female voice produced almost no resonant response. A child's voice produced almost no resonant response. Only a specific range of adult male vocal frequency, roughly the speaking register of a baritone, would set the room itself vibrating. For 60 years, this was noted and left alone. Then Eneix measured it, and the measurement was 110 hertz. In the same year Eneix formally published her findings, a research team at the University of Salford released a controlled study in which subjects were exposed to sounds at various frequencies while their brain activity was monitored. At 110 hertz, activity in the prefrontal cortex measurably decreased. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain responsible for rational analysis, critical evaluation, and the suppression of emotional response. It is, in the simplest terms, the part that judges. At 110 hertz, the judging stops. At the same time, activity in regions associated with emotional processing, spatial reasoning, and pattern recognition increased. The brain shifted states. The part that evaluates went quiet. The part that perceives and connects came forward. This is the brain state that ancient traditions across every culture on Earth described as the condition required for prophetic experience, for divine communication, for the kind of perception that oracles and priests claim to achieve in specific sacred spaces. The opened mind. And the Oracle Room at Hall Sufflieni was producing it reliably, predictably, by design. When Eneix understood what the Salford study meant in the context of her measurements, she went back and read the 1902 excavation report again. There was a detail she had passed over. The resonance from the Oracle Room does not stay in the Oracle Room. It travels through the rock into adjacent chambers. A voice spoken into the alcove could be felt in attenuated form throughout the second level of the complex. 7,000 people had been buried in this building. 7,000. That is not a local burial rate. That is a pilgrimage rate. People carried their dead across water to this specific island, to this specific underground complex, to be placed as close as possible to the room on the second level. Not because it was convenient, because something happened here. Something important enough to justify crossing the Mediterranean with the weight of your dead. And Anix now believed she knew what it was. She brought that conviction to a conference in 2013. The reception was not what she had hoped for. The problem was not that her measurements were disputed. The measurements were solid. The frequency was real. The neurological findings from Salford were real. Nobody in the room challenged the data. The problem was the conclusion, because the conclusion Anix was moving toward required accepting something the academic mainstream was not prepared to accept. That a culture operating 5,000 years ago, with stone tools and no written record of physical science, had deliberately designed a room to alter the brain state of the people inside it. Not stumbled onto, designed. The argument against it is not unreasonable. Humans have always been sensitive to sound. We have always preferred some spaces to others. It is entirely possible that builders discovered through direct experience that certain shapes produced certain feelings and refined those shapes over generations without any formal understanding of the physics involved. Trial and error aimed at a feeling. Anix had anticipated this argument. She had spent 3 years preparing her answer. In the same period she was developing the Malta research, a series of acoustic studies at other prehistoric sites had been published, quietly, in specialist journals, read by small audiences of researchers working in what was still a fringe subfield. Stonehenge, in its original enclosed configuration, produced resonance peaks at 110 to 111 Hz. The King's Chamber inside the Great Pyramid of Giza had been measured at 111 Hz. The Passage Tomb in Newgrange in Ireland, built around 3200 BCE, produced resonance at 110 Hz. Underground ceremonial galleries at Chavin de Huantar in Peru, built by a culture on the opposite side of the world more than 1,000 years after Malta, with no documented contact with any Mediterranean civilization, produced standing waves peaking in the same frequency range. Different continents, different centuries, different cultures, different materials, different tools, different religious traditions. Same frequency. Anix stood at the conference and put that list on the screen. The room went quiet. Because trial and error aimed at a vague feeling does not produce global convergence on a specific number. Trial and error produces variation. It produces sites where the resonance peaks at 95 Hz, at 130 Hz, at 78 Hz, at every point along the human auditory experience. It does not produce sites separated by 5,000 years and 10,000 miles, all clustering at the same narrow frequency band. That convergence implies a target. Someone knew what 110 Hz did to the human brain. Someone knew before there was a word for frequency, before there was a word for brain, and they built that knowledge into stone in enough places that we are still finding it. The site that Anix spent the most time on in her subsequent research is one most people outside the field have never heard of. Chavin de Huantar sits at nearly 3,000 meters above sea level in the Peruvian Andes. Built around 900 BCE by the Chavin culture. Beneath its stone platforms runs a network of underground galleries carved from rock in a configuration that, when Anix and other researchers first mapped it acoustically, produced results that took months to fully interpret. Sound introduced at one point in the system traveled, transformed, and emerged at other points in ways that initially made no sense. Specific instruments, conch shell trumpets the Chavin called pututu, produced frequencies in the galleries that interacted with the stone walls to create a phenomenon participants described as directional collapse. The sensation that sound was coming from everywhere simultaneously, that the boundaries of the individual body were dissolving into the surrounding space. Neurologically, this is consistent with a specific category of altered state. The Chavin are known to have used psychoactive plants in ceremony. San Pedro cactus is depicted throughout their iconography. The standard interpretation has always been that the altered states the chavin induced were pharmacological, but the acoustic research suggested something more precise. The galleries and the instruments together produced states that neither alone could achieve. The chavin priests were running multiple frequencies through a space engineered to amplify and distribute them. The plants opened a door, the architecture determined what was on the other side of it. And the frequency the pututu and the gallery walls produced in combination overlapped with the frequency Enaeus had measured in the oracle room in Malta. When she put this finding alongside the others, Malta, Stonehenge, Giza, Newgrange, Chavin, she described it in her research notes with characteristic understatement, as a pattern requiring explanation. What she did not write in the notes, but said in an interview years later, was that when she finally mapped all 5 sites on the same chart and saw the frequencies align, she sat with the data for a long time before she was ready to talk about it with anyone, because it was starting to suggest something she wasn't sure she wanted to say out loud. The brain state produced at 110 Hz, the quieted prefrontal cortex, the widened pattern recognition, the shift in processing from critical evaluation to perceptual synthesis, is the same state that modern neuroscience associates with a specific cognitive phenomenon: insight. Not learning, not recall, not the slow accumulation of information that produces expertise. Insight. The moment when a problem that has resisted weeks of analysis suddenly resolves, when a connection invisible to careful examination becomes obvious, when you understand something not by reasoning toward it, but by simply, without transition, knowing it. The neuroscience of insight has been studied seriously for roughly 30 years. What has emerged is precise enough to be uncomfortable. Genuine insight events are not products of focused logical analysis. The prefrontal cortex during genuine insight is not more active than baseline, it is less active. The mode of cognition that produces insight is expansive, defocused, and associated with the same neural signatures that appear during meditative states, during dreaming, and, as the frequency research now suggests, during exposure to 110 Hz in an enclosed stone space. You do not think your way to insight. You open your way to it. Every philosophical breakthrough of the ancient world, every vision that became a religion, every discovery that built a civilization, how many came from people standing in rooms like the oracle room, rooms tuned to a frequency that opened the deepest layers of the human mind on demand? This was the question Enaeus had been building toward for 20 years. And it was the question she finally committed to in print in 2014. She called it in the paper's abstract, "Structured Access to Non-Ordinary Cognition in Prehistoric Sacred Architecture." The academic language is careful. What it means is this: the ancient world built machines. Not machines of metal and wiring, machines made of stone and geometry and resonance, built to a precise specification, calibrated to a specific biological target, deployed across multiple cultures on multiple continents over several thousand years. Machines designed to open the human mind. And then, without explanation, without known cause, the knowledge of how to build them and what they were for disappeared. Pythagoras is remembered today primarily for a theorem about right triangles. Ancient sources describe him as something else: a man who spent more than 20 years studying in Egypt, who was initiated into the Egyptian temple tradition, who returned to Greece describing knowledge so significant he spent the rest of his life attempting to transmit it. He called it the music of the spheres, the concept that the universe is organized by the same mathematical ratios that govern harmony in sound, that the cosmos at its fundamental level vibrates, that the architecture of reality and the architecture of sound are the same architecture. Pythagoras did not claim to have discovered it. He claimed to have received it from older sources in older places where it had been understood for longer than he could trace. And in Sanskrit texts that predate Pythagoras by 1,000 years, the same idea appears with its own name, Nada Brahma. The universe is sound. The fundamental nature of reality is vibrational. Matter is slow vibration. Consciousness is faster vibration. The source frequency from which all others derive is the ground of existence itself. Modern string theory at its most fundamental level describes the basic constituents of matter as one-dimensional vibrating strings whose different modes of oscillation produce different particles. The universe is patterns of vibration.
The ancient world said so, and built rooms to interact with those patterns directly. By the time Pythagoras carried this knowledge to Greece, it had already begun its long fade from engineering into metaphor. By the Roman period, almost entirely symbolic. By the medieval period, philosophy. By modernity, gone. In 1999, the House Affliani Hypogeum closed to the public. The limestone was fragile. Visitor breath and body heat were causing damage. When it reopened, access was limited to 30 visitors per day. The comprehensive acoustic study Enique's work pointed toward never happened. Not during the closure, not after. The funding was not there. The institutional priority was preservation, not investigation. And the Oracle Room continued doing what it had been doing for 5,000 years, vibrating at 110 hertz, waiting for the study that has not yet been done. That sequence, documented finding, institutional silence, absence of follow-up, is worth naming, not as conspiracy. What it requires is something much more ordinary, a finding that doesn't fit existing categories, that sits at the intersection of archaeology, neuroscience, acoustics, and ancient history, disciplines that rarely share funding and rarely agree on methodology. The Oracle Room doesn't need to be suppressed, it only needs to fall between the lines. For the last century, that is precisely where it has fallen. There is one more detail Enique's returned to repeatedly, something documented in 1902 that no subsequent researcher fully addressed. During the original excavation, workers found red ochre paintings on the ceiling directly above the Oracle Room. The images are partially deteriorated. Spirals, geometric marks, and one image Enique's focused on in her final paper. A figure in a horizontal position, surrounded by lines radiating outward from the body. A body surrounded by waves. If the Oracle Room was what the acoustic evidence suggests, a space designed to produce a specific altered state in the human brain, then the chamber above may have been the record. The space where the operators left their own account of what happened below. Drawn in red ochre 5,000 years ago. In 2019, a team at the University of Malta conducted a preliminary acoustic survey of 2 above-ground temple complexes. Both date to the same period as the Hypogeum. Both roofless now, eroded by 5 millennia of weather. Even in their deteriorated state, both produced measurable resonance consistent with the Hypogeum findings. The Gigantia complex produced its strongest resonance near the central altar. The measurement was 108 hertz, 2 hertz from the Oracle Room. The team called for a comprehensive survey of all 7 Maltese temple complexes, 3 years, modest funding. As of the writing of this script, it has not been conducted. In a 2020 interview, Enique's was asked what she believed the Oracle Room was built for. She said the room was designed to reliably produce a specific neurological state in the people inside it. She said the people who built it understood that state as sacred. She said the evidence suggests they pursued it deliberately, repeatedly, across multiple sites over hundreds of years. Then the interviewer asked what people experienced in that state. Enique's paused, then said, "That's the question the room was built to answer. Not by me, by the people who went inside it 5,000 years ago and came back out knowing something. We do not know what they knew. We only know that whatever it was, they considered it important enough to build a machine to reach it, to bury their dead as close to that machine as the stone would allow, and to leave a diagram on the ceiling above it, a body surrounded by waves. The oracle room has been unchanged for 5,000 years. The frequency is still there, the alcove still carved to the same depth, the chamber still producing the same effect on a baritone voice it produced when the last priest stood there for the final time and said whatever was said and walked out into the light. We do not know his name. We do not know what he believed. We do not know what came through in the opened state. We only know that when Linda Enique stood in that room in 1990 and spoke and heard what came back was not an echo. It was an answer to a question she hadn't finished asking yet. Whatever question it was, the oracle room was built to answer it, and 30 meters below a Maltese street, in a chamber carved by hands that should not have known what they were doing, it is still waiting for anyone willing to go down and speak.